All right, Erev Tov, I think we can get started. Just want to, welcome back for, I guess this is, a number of years already. It's a pleasure, Rav Nadi, and I think it's really nice. We're going to go into Nevi'im Achronim, something I don't believe we have done yet, and a systematic, a complete sefer. We've had here and there little talks, and as Rabbi Shulman yesterday mentioned, he started Yoshua. He likes Nevi'im Rishonim. He'll let other people do Nevi'im Achronim. So, Rav Nadi, that's you to lead us in Nevi'im Achronim. Of course, we begin with Yishayahu, the Navi of Nechama, of comfort, and that's what I think this year is going to be. I mean, it's an important topic, especially nowadays. But it's the second half, not exactly the second half, but from chapter 40 onwards, and then we're going to focus on. But as you said, to the beginning, Rav Nadi, of course, been teaching Tanakh for many, many years at SAR, Rabbi of Netivot HaShalom in Teaneck, and we go back many, many years to our days in yeshiva, and it's a pleasure to have him. And Vakasha, Rav Nadi, we look forward to many weeks of learning Yishayahu over the next year. Vakasha.
Thank you, Rabbi Kelman. And again, thank you for the opportunity to learn and this partnership between my shul, Netivot Shalom, and Torah in Motion, which is very precious to me. Torah in Motion is a very special organization, and Rabbi Kelman and Ilana, his wife, are very precious people and doing God's work up north and beyond with the Zoom. And so I really want to encourage everybody who can. Almost all the classes are free and everything, but you should
Not
certainly
almost, not all.
all
You don't
all
need almost all.
all the classes are free, but it costs money to run Torah in Motion. So I really would encourage everyone as part of their tzedakah slash not only tzedakah, but just please make sure that Torah in Motion continues to thrive, not just survive, but to thrive in the future. And please, if you can, donate in the future. So this year I decided we've been for a number of years in this slot in Torah in Motion. We've been learning Nevi'im Rishonim. We studied the book of Samuel. We studied the book of whatchamacallit of Kings, Malachim for many years. So we've done lots of Nevi'im Rishonim. And in past Gilgulim, in various settings, I've taught parts of the first half of Sefer Yishayahu. I've done that in many times. But I thought I wanted to challenge myself as well as us this year to study the second half of Yishayahu, which is generally not taught so much. And I wanted to do it really for two reasons. Number one, because, as I said, generally I've never taught it. And anytime I've taught Yishayahu in various settings, never get beyond the first half of the book of Yishayahu. So even though for some of you it may be strange that we're starting at Perek Mem, but I've taught from Perek Aleph onwards many times, and so I needed a challenge as well. Number two, as Rabbi Kelman alluded to, I think it's good to talk about nechama, about consolation after this difficult year, and many of the famous haftarot, many of the famous passages of consolation that we read during the summer after Tisha B'Av, as well as in other parts of the year, appear in this section of the book of Yishayahu. And so I thought it would be appropriate to learn those haftarot in depth. So that's our goal. What I'd like to do tonight is two things. Number one, I would like to simply give a short overview of the book of Yishayahu in terms of its structure very quickly. And then I would like to probably tonight, the bulk of the time, we're going to speak about the controversial, interesting issue of the authorship of the second half of the book of Yishayahu. Before we go into, in depth, the actual content, we should talk about the kind of elephant in the room, which is whether the book of Yishayahu, is there one Yishayahu, is there two Yishayahus, or is there three Yishayahus even? And whether it makes a difference which I think is even the more important question for us as readers of Tanakh from a more traditional point of view. So let's start at the beginning. Simply, the book of Yishayahu. The book of Yishayahu begins what we call Nevi'im Rishonim. It doesn't call it that. There's no little heading called Nevi'im Rishonim in Tanakh itself. It's an after the fact, a moniker that we impose because there were prophets much later in history. So we call the prophets Yishayahu, Yirmiyahu, Yechezkel, I'm sorry, because Nevi'im Achronim, I said Nevi'im Rishon. Nevi'im Achronim, sorry, thank you. Because the first prophets were in the time of the conquest of the land of Israel, in the time of Joshua, and in the time of the Shoftim, the judges, and in the time of the early kings, those prophets are called Nevi'im Rishonim. But again, it's in retrospect. Just like I'm sure during the time of the Rishonim, the medieval commentaries, if you were living in 1100, walking on the streets of Paris and you met Rashi or somebody, you didn't say, "Oh, hi, Rashi, you're a Rishon." It's just in retrospect, just like, they didn't call themselves, "Oh, I'm a middle age, I'm a Jew from the Middle Ages." They just called themselves, "I'm a Jew," walking around the streets of Ashkenaz or Sfarad. We today call it the Middle Ages. So there's no such thing as Nevi'im Rishonim, Nevi'im Achronim, Treyasar. It's just a later moniker that is, and when exactly that moniker starts to be used, it's probably pretty late in terms of the history. It's certainly not in the original translations of the Bible, like the Septuagint and the Vulgate and Qumran and all the various versions of the Tanakh. So we are dealing with Nevi'im Achronim. Number one. Number two, Nevi'im Achronim is radically different than Nevi'im Rishonim. Nevi'im Rishonim, we have prophets, but the prophets don't give speeches generally, very short. They give prophecies, predictive prophecies, tochacha, but you don't have long, very long, elaborate, complex, literary, poetic speeches that are given by the prophet, right? Eliyahu tells Achav, "Haratzachta v'gam yarashta," in the story of Navot and the Kerem Navot. But he doesn't go on for 30 psukim with elaborate chiastic structures and patterning and all that stuff. There's a line here, there's a line there, there's prophecies, there's historical prophecies, but you don't have these kind of elaborate ne'umim, speeches that are the focus of the Nevi'im. Nevi'im Achronim is radically different in that way because the style is much more, and that's one of the terms that's used in the book of, in Nevi'im Achronim, ne'um. It's speeches, long poetic speeches that play with literary techniques of biblical poetry, parallelism, structure, etc., etc. So it has a different feel than Nevi'im Rishonim. It's not a classical history book, and it's not even a classical Nevi'im Rishonim history book like Shoftim or Shmuel or Malachim. It is prophecies where you have the prophetic view on what is occurring historically at the time. The book of Yishayahu divides itself into 5 or 6 major units. If you look at the book starts, it tells us in its introduction about Yishayahu ben Amotz, asher chazah al, read the first pasuk correctly, so I don't want to just do it from memory. Chazon Yishayahu ben Amotz, asher chazah al Yehuda v'Yerushalayim, bimei Uzziah Yotam, Achaz Chizkiyahu Malchei Yehuda. So the introduction to the book tells us that Yishayahu ben Amotz was prophesied about Judah and Jerusalem. That's very important. Prophets generally, in the time of Yishayahu and other times, will prophesy. They have 3 choices. They can prophesy about Judah alone. They can prophesy about the northern kingdoms alone, or they can prophesy about both. Some Nevi'im only prophesied to the northern kingdoms. Eliyahu Hanavi, we never find him talking to anybody in Judea. We never find him talking to the Jews of Judea. We never find him really talking to the kings of Judea. He's talking to Achav, to the northern tribes and the northern kings. Yishayahu is talking, this Yishayahu is exclusively speaking to the Jews in Judah and Jerusalem, and he's exclusively interacting with four kings, Uzziyahu, Yotam, Achaz, and Chizkiyahu. When did these kings live? We know from intercalculating between biblical sources and external biblical sources, we know that what we're dealing here is in the middle of the 8th century BCE, 750 to 700 BCE. So this is the beginning of the book of Yishayahu. It's a time with, just to give you the historical background, when we look at the early parts of the book of Yishayahu, so Yishayahu is prophesying during the time of the middle of the 8th century. It's a time of great transition in terms of superpowers. If you look at the book of Melachim and the second half of the book of Melachim, Eliyahu, Elisha, all those guys, the major opponent of Israel in the early 900s, I'm sorry, the late 900s, but late means like 920, 910, 900, right? You're going in the opposite direction in terms of numbers. You're going down. So in the late 900s, early 800s, when Eliyahu, and then a few decades later when Elisha, is the major threat to the northern tribes is Aram, the Arameans up in the north of Israel, like Hezbollah, except not in Lebanon, but more in Syria, Turkey. The Aramean kingdom presents the greatest threat, and the wars that take place in the early parts, the latter parts of the book of Kings 1 and the beginning of Kings 2 are all wars dealing with Aram. By the time we're going to get to the book of Isaiah, which corresponds with the middle of the second book of Melachim, middle of the second book of Kings, chapter 15, 16, 17, we are now in a moment of transition when the great superpower, Aram, is on the decline, and the great superpower that's emerging is Assyria. Assyria, which is in the more east, the great Assyrian power, which is becoming the hegemon in the Middle East. And this becomes the century. By the 740s, 750s, 740s, Assyria is becoming the dominant power in the Middle East, eventually swooping down to destroy Aram, and then eventually to destroy the northern kingdom, what we call Galut Shomron, the exile of Shomron, which takes place during the life and times of Yishayahu ben Amoz, Asher Chazah al Yudav Yerushalayim. The destruction of Shomron takes place in the life of Yishayahu Hanavi in 722, 720 BCE, and continues. The rise of the Assyrian powers reaches from our point of view, from Jewish point of view, it raises its head up until the 700 or early 600, 698, 696, whatever it is, with the threat of the destruction of Jerusalem and the miraculous victory of Chizkiyahu, the last king that Yishayahu interacts with. So that's basically the period of time that the first sentence of the book specifically talks about, and talks about the kings, talks about four kings, Uzziyahu, Achaz, Yotam, and Chizkiyahu. Uzziyahu is king for 52 years, according to the book of Kings. Isaiah begins prophesying according to the book of Kings, according to the book of Isaiah. Chapter 6, Perek Vav, he begins prophesying in the last year of Uziyahu. So his prophecies relate to the latter part of Uziyahu, Achaz, I'm sorry, Yotam and Achaz and Chizkiyahu. There are no explicit prophecies directed to Yotam in the first half of the book. There are explicit prophecies where Uziyahu is mentioned. There are explicit prophecies and dialogue with Achaz, and there are explicit prophecies with Chizkiyahu and Yishayahu. Yotam is a kind of silent partner. We don't know a lot about Yotam. We have very little information about him, and in the book of Kings, nor in the book of Yishayahu. And it may be that some of the more anonymous prakim that occur in the first half of the book of Yishayahu were said during the time of Yotam, and were also said or directed to Yotam, but there is no superscription in those chapters. Number two, the second point I want to make is Uziyahu was king for 52 years. I mentioned that. That is a very long time. That's even longer than Castro. And that's pretty hard to beat somebody like Castro, who was a dictator. And so he is king for 52 years, which of course implies, on one hand, stability, great stability, as opposed to what's going on in the north, where every couple of years or every couple of months there's a coup. And a coup is a French word, right? Right, Jay? It's a French word, I think. So that snuck into English. So thank you from Canada. So it's a coup. In the northern kingdoms, every couple of years there's another coup. In the last 50 years of the reign of the kings in the north, tremendous instability, tremendous problems, tremendous internal battles, external battles, which eventually the collapse of the northern kingdom. But Uziyahu is a very stable king. But the Bible also tells us that Uziyahu got tzaraat at some point in his life. The book of Divrei Hayamim tells us that Uziyahu got tzaraat, and he was in the Beit HaTzarat. He was kind of exiled. And so many scholars and traditional modern writers will suggest that you have to take the 52 years with a grain of salt, and that maybe some of those years he was just a kind of ceremonial king, where Yotam was actually running the show. And so maybe more of what occurs during the time of Uziyahu should be attributed to Yotam. Anyway, that's the beginning of the book of Yishayahu. The book of Yishayahu is divided, as I said, into 5 or 6 parts. So let's just get a quick overview. Chapter 1 through chapter 12 are prophecies, and mentioned explicitly. These are the prophecies, the early prophecies of Yishayahu ben Amoz, where Uziyahu is mentioned, Achaz is mentioned. It's clear that this is all taking place in the early decades of the career of Yishayahu. And there are very famous prakim in here. The Isaiah wall, for example, comes from here. Nathaniel Har Beit Hashem, that they're going to put their swords into plowshares. It's a description of the sins of Judah as well as the sins of the northern tribe. It may be hinting at the upcoming destruction of the northern tribes that Judah is supposed to learn from. And it talks about the whatchamacallit, not for me. I don't. I hope the sound isn't disappearing. I hope most people it's okay. I hope for most people it's okay. So in the basically from chapter 1 through chapter 12, which is one of the shortest prakim in Tanakh, and it actually really should be part of chapter 11, but for some reason the Christians put it as a separate chapter. And it's a beautiful. It ends off with a beautiful vision should be very familiar to us. Chapter 12. Hine el Yeshuati eftach v'lo avchad ki oziu zrimat yad Adonai v'yihid li d'Yeshua ushav temayim v'sason v'nei Yeshua, etc., etc. Ki gadol b'kirbech kadosh Yisrael. So chapter 1 through 12 is the presentation of the sins of Israel, the upcoming punishment to Israel, the major goal of Yishayahu, which is to teach the people that they should trust in God and not trust in Assyria, trust in God and not trust in the other nations, and reaffirm the covenant. From chapter 13 through chapter 27 or so, if you look, again, I'm not doing it in depth, you go and you'll find what we call the Masaot, which are the long prophecies of doom on the various nations of the world. So, for example, in chapter 13, it talks about Masa Bavel, talks about the prophecy, the burden of Bavel. If you turn to chapter 15, the end of 14. Bishnat mot hamelech Achaz, haya hamasa hazeh. Verse 28. Al tismichi pleshet. Don't be joyous, pleshet. So this is the masa of pleshet, the burden of the Philistines. Chapter 15, Masa Moav, the prophecy about the destruction of Moab. All of these little city-states and countries that surround Judah. Chapter 17, Masa Damesek, the burden and the prophecy about Damesek. Then we have chapter 19, Masa Mitzrayim, the Masa related to Egypt, and the Nevuot related to the destruction of Egypt. And then we have in chapter 21, Masa Midbar Yam, the Masa about Midbar Yam, whatever that refers to, whatever territory that refers to. And it continues all the way through chapter 23, Masat Sor, which is very relevant, the Masa of Tyre up in Lebanon, Tyre, T-Y-R-E, not T-I-R-E, Masa Tyre in Lebanon, and a few, chapter 24 and chapter 25, 26, and 27 are kinds of appendices to these chapters, which speak about the chapters of God's tremendous destruction that's going to come together with God's salvation of those who are loyal to God. From chapter 28 through chapter 35, it's generally understood that you have here a series of chapters of tochacha, of great reproof to the various various different groups within the society, and they all start with the term hoy, woe. Look at chapter 28. Hoy ateret geut shikorei Ephraim, the drunks of Ephraim. And then in chapter 29, Hoy Ariel, Hoy Ariel. Ariel is a reference to Jerusalem. Woe to Jerusalem and what's happening to Jerusalem. The middle of chapter 29, Hoy hama'amikim b'Hashem listor eitzah. Those who try to pull a fast one on God and do averot in private. Chapter 30, Hoy banim sorurim. The ones, woe to all those who are rebellious, and Egypt will not help you. You think Egypt will help you, but God is the one to trust in and not Egypt. And that is once again emphasized in chapter 31. Hoi hayordim Mitzrayim le'ezra, al susim Yishayahu, vayiftechu al rechev. They rely on Egypt to come to their aid, which was obviously a constant, right, theme. The Torah already talks about don't go down to Egypt and to get their horses. Horses in the ancient world are tanks. It's the tanks of the ancient world. It's the Humvees of the ancient world. It's the F-16s of the ancient world. And it continues in chapter 32. We have you have in whatchamacallit, in chapter 33, Hoy Shodade, woe to the enemies and the the salvation of Jerusalem, and then the destruction of Edom and the salvation of the Jewish people. And that's the second major part. The third major part of the book. 1 to 12 are the initial nivuot of setting the scene of Israel is a wayward soul. Israel has lost trust in God. Israel is tested by God. Achaz is tested. Will he trust in God or will he trust in Ashur to help him? And that's basically the message of chapter 1 through chapter 12. Chapter 13 through 27 are the nivuot al hagoyim, the nivuot on the nations of the world. Chapter 28 through 35 are a series of woe chapters, woe on various groups in Judah and in Israel, and ultimately woe to the enemies of the Jewish people and salvation of the Jewish people. That's 3 parts. The next part is chapter 36 through 39, which is a series of narratives that are cut and pasted from the book of Kings. Almost word for word, it's exactly the same narrative as from Sefer Melachim. Chapter 36 through 39 in the book is basically about the Matzor, the siege of Jerusalem in the year 700 by the Assyrian king, and eventually who we come to know as Sancherev, the one who comes and challenges Chizkiyahu, etc., etc. The great salvation, all that is but it's narrative. It's a totally different, it feels like you're reading the book of Kings once again. It is its own special unit. It's its own special unit. Next, and it concludes in chapter 39. If you look in chapter 39, at the time when Chizkiyahu was under siege and he was sick, the Bible tells us that there was a visit from the Babylonian king. In chapter 39. Ba'etahi shalach merodach Baladan ben Baladan melech Bavel Sfarim umincha Chizkiyahu. He sends him, Bikur Cholim cards. He sends him Bikur Cholim cards to help him. Now, why does he send them Bikur Cholim cards? Probably because, simple reading is, because he's under threat from the Assyrian hegemon, and Bavel is a small little city-state at this time. In the year 700, Babylonia, is not a threat. It is a small threat, but he wants to make allies. And Chizkiyahu is willing to make an alliance with the king of Bavel, which leads to Isaiah making a prophecy, a very negative prophecy, which kind of closes out this 4th section. And this 4th section ends up with Isaiah saying, that these are the people from Bavel. And Isaiah says in verse 5, Vayomer Yishayahu Chizkiyahu Shma Dvar Hashem Tzvakot Hinei Yamim Ba'im. God is coming. V'nisa kol asher b'veitecha v'asher atzru avotecha hayom hazeh Bavel lo yivater davar There's going to be an exile by Babylon. He doesn't tell him exactly when, but he tells him it's in the future. It's not now. Now it's not practical either because Bavel doesn't have the power to exile anybody in the year 700. Number two, Bavel is looking for an alliance with Judah, not to make an enemy of Judah, because Assyria, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. Assyria is the dominant power that needs to be countered. And so that's the way this, so to speak, this fourth unit ends. And then we have chapter 40, which is generally divided in most between chapter 40 to 54 are the great nivuot of Nechama, so many of them that we know, the great nivuot of consolation that we know and love from the Haftarot, and the last section from 55 to 66, which are nivuot of both Churban or potential Churban, as well as nivuot Nechama and Tochacha. We have to talk a little bit more deeply when we get there. What exactly is the connective tissue between those last 11 chapters of the book? So we really have so we have 1 to 12, 13 to 27, 28 to 35, 36 to 39, 40 to 54, and then the sixth part is 55 or so to the end of the book. That is the basic overview of Sefer Yishayahu as it's divided. At some point in the study of this book, in the modern era, specifically in the late 1700s, early 1800s, people started to notice that there's a very different flavor in the second half of the book, meaning from chapter 40 on. Again, even though I divided the book into 6 parts, Bigadol, it divides into 2 major parts. In the first part of the book, there's very little nechama, there's very little consolation. In the second part of the book, it's mostly consolation from chapter 40 on. And so people started to notice that. And they said, wow, it's really, really weird. It's very weird that you have a very different style, flavor in the second half of the book than you have in the first half of the book. Number 2, they noticed that Yishayahu does not appear as a character. Yishayahu does not appear as a name. Yishayahu does not appear at all in the second half of the book at all. Simply Yishayahu does not appear in any form or shape from chapter 40 on. So first of all, they noticed different style. Number 2, different thrust. Number 2, Yishayahu does not appear in the second half of the book. Number 3, they noticed a couple of other things which are very strange, or at least strange to people who weren't necessarily very traditional. And that is, and let me see if I can share my Tanakh here. Yeah. So share my Tanakh, if you open up and you look in Tanakh, if you look in the book of Yishayahu, and you look at the second half of the book, you find some very strange phenomenon. For example, in the second half of the book, remember, Yishayahu ben Amoz asher chaza al Yehuda v'Yerushalayim, in the time of Uziyahu, etc. He's living in the middle of the 8th century. That's when he's living. He's living in the middle of the 8th century. And all of a sudden, you read in chapter 44 of the book of Yishayahu, you read a strange, towards the end of the book, the end of the chapter, Hashem says, the Navi says, Ko amar Hashem go alecha v'yotzrecha mibaten. I'm the one who created the world. Beautiful, beautiful, beautiful. I'm the one mekim dvarav do, va'atzat malachav yashlim. And I'm telling Jerusalem, you will return. Ule'arei Yehuda tibanena. Beautiful. Ha'omer l'koresh ro'i, who says to Cyrus, my shepherd, v'chol cheftzi yashlim, v'leimor l'Yushalayim tibaneh, v'eichal tivasein, who says to Cyrus, the king of Persia, v'chol cheftzi yashlim, v'leimor l'Yushalayim tibaneh, v'eichal tusad, that he will say to Jerusalem, Jerusalem, you should be rebuilt, and the temple should be once again reestablished. And then in the beginning of the next chapter, once again, Ko amar Hashem lemishicho lekoresh asher hechezakti bimino afateach liftoch ani lefanecha elech, I will, etc. So Koresh is the Mashiach. Mashiach meaning my anointed one. Now, people notice that. Wow. Cyrus? Isaiah is living in the middle of the 700s, or maybe by the time this prophecy, if it's being said in the streets of Jerusalem by Isaiah in 700 BCE. What does it mean, Koresh? Koresh is 180 years, 170 years away. What does it mean to talk about Koresh? Koresh is after Assyria is no longer on the stage, and after Bavel is no longer on the stage as an active player. And he's talking about the Persian Empire. So what's going on? Very strange. Very strange. So you could say he's predicting, but the problem is not at this stage simply the prediction about talking about someone who is far in the future. It's what would that mean to someone living in the middle of the 700s? What would that prophecy mean to them? It's like somebody walking around in the, during the Civil War and saying, there's going to be a president called Trump and he's going to put tariffs with China. And they're going to say, what's China? What's Trump? Who's China? China is some foreign country that has no power on us. What would it mean to them to talk about Cyrus? What is it talking about? Number four. So far, three major problems. Number one, the style seems to be very different. It's all about nechama and redemption, and it doesn't talk about the destruction of Jerusalem very much. Doesn't talk, number one. Number two, it seems to talk about, it doesn't mention Isaiah once. From chapter 40 to the end, Isaiah is not mentioned at all. Number three, somebody like Koresh is mentioned, which makes very little sense to the average person walking around on the streets of Jerusalem in the 7th century, living under the threat of Assyria, doesn't even know that Bavel is going to be a hegemon in 100 years, and certainly doesn't know that 170 years from now, Persia is going to knock off Bavel. So what are you talking about? Number four, if you turn to later chapters in this book, you get the sense that we're already after Churban Habayit. Yishayahu lives in the 700s, which means that the temple is still standing for another 120 years, 40 years, whenever he's talking. But when you go and you turn to a chapter like chapter 60, let's just take one example, chapter 63, and you look at a pasuk like this, Hashem is talking about Habeit mishamayim u're'eh mizvul kodshecha v'tifartecha. God, look down and see. Ki ata avinu, ki Avraham lo yadanu. Return to us. Lamitzar yarshu am kodshecha. Sarenu bosisu mikdeshecha. They destroyed your temple. It sounds like the Navi is describing a reality that he's experiencing. Bosisu mikdeshecha. They destroyed your temple. Or look at Perek Samich Dalid, the next Perek. If you look at Perek Samich Dalid in Pasuk Chet, Al tiktsof Hashem ad ma'od va'al ad tiskor avon hein habet namcha kulanu orei kodshecha hayu midbar Sion midbar haita Yerushalayim shmama Beit kodshenu v'tifartenu asher hilalucha avotenu haya lisreifat eish v'chol machmadenu haya lechorba. That sounds like the temple is sitting in ruins. In 700, the temple is not sitting in ruins. The temple is fine and dandy. But in 550 BCE, 30 or 40 years after the destruction of the temple is still sitting in ruins. Persia is now starting to become a major threat to Bavel. It's a totally different social and political reality. Makes sense to give a nevuah, to talk in those terms. Okay, so this is a problem and led people to a problem, and therefore led to these problems combined with a certain theology as the modern period developed, and as more and more of the Bible critics became less and less religious, and the world of academia became less and less religious, the assumption became that prophecy is not real. God does not communicate with human beings. Prophets are reflecting their own philosophy, theology, perspective, approach, and couching it in the name of God. And so by the late 1800s, the dominant theory in academia is, well, you know why Yishayahu ben Amos doesn't appear in the second half of the book, and you know why the prophet is talking about Koresh, and he assumes that the temple is destroyed, and he's giving prophecies about the temple already destroyed, is because prophecy, this second half of the book, was not said by Yishayahu ben Amos. It was said by a different prophet. Hundreds of years later, or 170 years later, and at some point later on in the history of the redaction of the book, for whatever reasons, some of them stylistic, some of them literary, some of them religious, theological, the final editors of the book of Yishayahu decided to put together these two quote-unquote prophets into one book and call it Sefer Yishayahu. But it's really two different prophets, and there's therefore Isaiah 1 and Isaiah 2. Isaiah 1 and Isaiah 2. And this becomes the dominant theory, but it goes together with a theological premise. And the theological premise is that prophecy is not predictive. God doesn't speak to human beings. And so since there's no I mean, maybe there's no God either, according to this thing. But since God, the prophet can't predict the future, he can only talk about the reality that he sees and couches it in prophetic terms. That becomes the dominant theory in academic circles to the point where, and this also becomes, and then eventually later on, even develops a third theory, which is the theory of three Isaiahs. There's actually Isaiah 1, Yishayahu Aleph from 1 to 39, Yishayahu Bet from 40 to 54, and Yishayahu Gimel, Triter Isaiah, not Deutero Isaiah, but the Triter, the third Isaiah, from chapter 55 through chapter 66. That is the dominant, regnant approach with all kinds of different dreidlach and variations within the academy till today. Till today. Unless you're teaching in a very religious seminary, either a Christian seminary or a Jewish seminary, that's definitely the dominant approach. And this becomes a big battle. In the battle between traditionalists and biblical critics in the late 1800s and early 1900s, this becomes a litmus test of how frum you are. If you, in any way, if you believe in the idea that there's a double, that there's two Isaiahs or even three Isaiahs, you are seen as out of the pale. And if not, not. And that's why, for example, till today, it's fascinating. Those who have the Dat Mikra version of Yishayahu, Dat Mikra, because Yishayahu is very big, so it publishes it in 2 volumes. But it, God forbid, it didn't want anybody to think that they weren't from. So chapter 1 goes till chapter 35, the first volume, and the second volume starts at chapter 36, which is not a logical way to divide the book. Whatever you believe theologically, it's just a silly way to divide the book. But they divided it that way so that nobody could be choshesh, that God forbid they believed in the classical academic notion of a second Isaiah. And this became a big fight. In fact, some of the more traditionalists in Germany, for example, attacked some of the teachers in Rabbi David Tzvi Hoffman's seminary as, some of the professors, they believe in 2 Isaiahs, and therefore they're not really so frum. Okay, so this was a major issue. So how do you approach this issue? So we already said the academic approach is to claim that there are 2 or 3 authors at different times, different sources, and prophecy can't happen. The other, of course, traditional extreme is to say, what are you talking about? God can split the sea. God can come down on Sinai. God can create the world. So God can predict the future. And if God can predict the future, he can also tell Isaiah in the middle of the 700s BCE about events that will occur in the future. And that's it. On the other hand, you still are left with the problem, but those are the 2 extremes. You're still left with the problem. If it's true that God gave a nevuah and predicted the future to the Navi, there's still a secondary problem is how would that make any sense to the people listening to these nevuot in the middle of Jerusalem in 700 when the temple is still standing, when there is no Persia and there is no Koresh? So that they say, we don't, there's no real solution, but there is a solution, and that's the Dat Mikra solution. And then I want to kind of narrow the other solutions. Dat Mikra takes the view that understands a certain passage. If you look in the book of Isaiah in chapter 8, Isaiah is very frustrated. At some point, the people aren't listening to him. And at some point, God says to him, don't listen to the people. And Tzor Te'udah, chatom Torah b'limudai, which is basically understood by this approach. Simply lock yourself up, chatom Torah, sit down and write, and close it up, bilimudai, and teach it to your students. V'chikiti la'Hashem hamastir panav mi Beit Yaakov v'kiviti lo. And one day, these prophecies will make sense, and you'll teach them, basically. Right now, just write it for your students. So in certain sense, this approach claims that yes, Yishayahu did not reveal these prophecies to the people walking around Judah and Jerusalem in the 700s. He wrote these prophecies that God gave him. He tucked them away. And then in the 150, 60 years later, the descendants, the students of Yishayahu, who had received these prophecies by tradition, they pop them up and they say, guys, this is what Isaiah predicted, and here it's happening in front of us. That's a second approach in the traditional camp. Rabbi Menachem Leibtag has given a twist to that and said maybe he even gave these prophecies publicly, but he never used the name Koresh. Isaiah just used the name, he named Mishicho, God's emissary will come. And later, when the book was finally redacted, because Chazal themselves say Yishayahu didn't write his book, it says Chizkiyahu v'siyato or Yoshiyahu v'siyato. Meaning, when the book was finally redacted, they put in the name Koresh as a, so to speak, this is what Yishayahu, and Yishayahu himself may not have known what God was referring to, but the final redactors put in and said, this is Pshat in what Yishayahu was saying. And then you would also have to say something along the lines that just like in the book of Tehillim, sometimes prophets, the Mishorer, the poet, speaks as if something has happened, even if it hasn't happened yet. He trusts so much in God that something has happened or will happen, that it's as if it's happened already. The same thing with the Churban Habayit. He talks about Churban Habayit as if it's already happened because he knows it's going to happen even if it hasn't happened yet. The middle approach, which is the approach that I am much more comfortable with, and the one that Rabbi Bazak, Rav Amnon Bazak from Yeshivat Har Etzion, my dear friend and Tanakh scholar as well, has pointed out that from a purely theological point of view, there is nothing per se that is problematic as long as you believe that God has the ability to speak to human beings. And as long as you believe that God could predict the future, there's nothing wrong with saying that in this specific instance, you don't have to say that. There's nothing wrong with saying that there were two prophets, one who lived in the mid-8th century BCE and one who lived in the mid-6th century BCE. And the prophecies, there are two books of Yishayahu that were put together. It doesn't have to be that way, but it could be that way. As long as you believe in prophecy, it's not theological. It's not one of the Yud Gimel Ikrim of the Rambam to say that the book of Yishayahu was written by one prophet. Who cares? To read from Rav Amnon Bazak, he says, Ulam, הטענות המהותיות על חוסר אחדותו של הספר אינם קשורות כלל וכלל לאמונה ביכולתו של הנביא לדעת ולהודיע את העתיד. The essential argument about whether this book is a unified book in terms of style, in terms of the events, in terms of the way it's presented, has absolutely nothing to do with whether you believe prophecy can happen and whether a prophet can predict and tell the future. This debate is a theological debate about the nature of prophecy. Okay? Now, memele, anachnu yicholim lasok kayom b'sheila zo. Today, without necessarily adopting the theological assumptions of the early Bible critics, anachnu yicholim kayom b'sheila zu mibli lihikanes klal v'ikar lavikuach hamahuti al emunah v'kfira. We don't have to get involved in this question of is this kfira, is this heresy or not. V'atana b'davar kiyumam shel shnei nevi'im shonim, and the claim that there were two different prophets living at two different times who wrote two different books, and we're going to show that even if there were two different prophets, the second half does play off of the first half, even if it's written in a different style. It probably clearly wanted to play off the first book. Achein ole b'kaneh echad im hashkafa olam datit habochenet et hadvarim legufam. Certainly, achein can certainly be work and fit and be complementary with a religious worldview which looks at the evidence in and of itself. And so potentially it could be in Achanami that there were two prophets. And I close with, for those who remember, I think one of Chaim Potak's books, where he mentions the Ibn Ezra at the beginning of chapter 40. Today it is accepted that Ibn Ezra probably was the first one to notice that probably, he doesn't say it's outright, but this is the basic understanding of Ibn Ezra. Today, Ibn Ezra is assumed to be the father of the theory of two Isaiahs. Because, let me see if I can pull it up. I don't know if we have it here. Let me see if I can pull it up in my myself, and then I'll put it on. Let's get rid for a second of this. Let's stop the share for a second, and let's see if we can pull it up. Ibn Ezra. See if it's online. Ibn Ezra al Sefer Yishayahu. Sorry. Ibn Ezra al Sefer Yishayahu. Ibn Ezra, who lived in the 1700s, Ibn Ezra, in the early 11 in the 1100s, Ibn Ezra al Sefer Yishayahu. So we even have it in Sepharia. Let's see. So let me pop it up. Okay. So let me go back to my Zoom and let's see if it pops up. It'll be interesting to see how he translates it. So Ibn Ezra on Isaiah 41. Everybody can see it? Nachamu nachamu ami. Nidbika zota parasha bavur shizkir lemala ki cholot sota melech gam banav yiglu lebavel. Al kein acharei zot hanechamot. First of all, Ibn Ezra notice that this chapter is connected to chapter 39. 39 was the visit of the king of Babylonia to Chizkiyahu in 700, and the prophecy of Yishayahu that they would go into exile, and the Otzrot HaMelech would go into exile, and therefore says Ibn Ezra, Al kein acharei zot hanechamot. After this, the Bible decides to put in the nechamot, the consolations of the next chapters. Now, listen to this. Ve'ela nechamot harishonot mechatzi hasefer al dat Rabbi Moshe HaKohen al bayit sheni. According to Rabbi Moshe HaKohen is Rabbi Moshe ibn Jikatila, one of the great Sephardic commentaries on Tanakh, most of which we have lost, and we only have fragments of it, mostly from other commentaries. One of the reasons why we lost it, it was written in Arabic, as opposed to Ibn Ezra, who wrote in Hebrew. Why did Ibn Ezra write in Hebrew? Because Ibn Ezra had to wander. Anybody that's ever learned about the history of Ibn Ezra, he wandered from Spain because of poverty. He wandered to England. He wandered to Tsarfat. He wandered all over the place. When you go to England and you go to France, it's not going to really help you to write a commentary in Arabic that nobody can read. You can't really read a lot of Arabic in those days in the middle of England. It's not like today. So the point is that he had to write in Hebrew. So what was a problem, or for him, was actually a great bounty for us that we have Ibn Ezra. But Rav Moshe ibn Jekatila wrote in Arabic, and it was lost to history, unfortunately. So Rav Moshe ibn Jekatila says the Nechamot, these prophecies, these early prophecies from the second half of the book, are all talking about Bayit Sheni. They're all talking about the redemption that would come in the second temple, the rebuilding of the second temple. That's Rav Moshe ben Jekatila, which would mean, potentially, that these nevuah were said by Yishayahu ben Amoz 170 years earlier about what would happen. But listen to what Ibn Ezra says. Ulefi da'ati hakol al galutenu. He says, no, all of the prophecies mentioned in chapter 40 through 66 are about the galut that we're in today in 1100 in Sfarad and Tsarfat and England. Rak yesh b'toch hasefer divrei galut Bavel lezecher. It's just that the prophet who wrote them mentioned the events of Galut Bavel and the salvation, ki Koresh sheshalach hagolah, that Koresh, who was able to send the exile back to Israel. And I'm putting in the words that most people understand Ibn Ezra to be saying, including Rav Bazak. What Ibn Ezra is saying is, and therefore today, or not today, but and therefore the Navi was using the redemption that happened in the time of Galut Bavel as a sign that the redemption of our Galut would happen as well. Which means, if you take the Ibn Ezra literally, that the prophet who wrote these Nechamot was using the events of Galut Bavel, which occurred already, and the redemption from Galut Bavel as a stepping stone, lezecher, for what would happen in the future. Let's see how Rabbi English translates. These first comments leads to the restoration of the temple. According to my opinion, to the coming redemption from our present exile. Prophecies concerning the Babylonian exile are introduced only as an exercise, an illustration, showing how Cyrus, who allowed the captive Jews to return to Jerusalem. The word lezecher is used the same as was well known Talmud. Is of the Ibn Ezra's of the opinion that the prophecies concerning the redemption from the Babylonian exile are mentioned in this part, not for their own sake, but only to strengthen the faith of Israel in those prophecies which refer to the Messianic period, that the fulfillment of the former may support the hope for the fulfillment of the latter. This remark of Ibn Ezra is based on the assumption that the prophecies contained in the second part of the book were announced either after the redemption from the Babylonian exile, or at least immediately before the fall of Babylon, when the coming events could already be foreseen by everyone. So Rabbi Sefaria understands it, I think, correctly, as the way Ibn Ezra is basically hinting at the idea of a second Isaiah. Okay, that is our introduction to the second half of the book of Yishayahu. In Yirtzeh Hashem, next week, we will continue and study the second half. We'll start with Perek Mem. That's what we're going to do. So next week is November. Tonight is November the 6th. Next week is November the 13th. November the 20th, I have parent-teachers conferences with SAR, so I have to take a break, but we'll return on the Wednesday night of Thanksgiving. We'll return American Thanksgiving, When is Canadian Thanksgiving?
Was already second Monday in October.
Oh, you already gave
So
Haidaya.
we too at Chat have parent-teacher interviews on Wednesday night, November 21st,
Oh,
and
okay.
Thursday, November 22nd, all day. We do a day and a half of
Oh, okay. The Seder. Right.
interview.
We do 2 days, not a day and a half.
Oh, we do a day
But
and a
we
half.
do
Okay.
another day, a Tuesday, the next week. Okay. What do
Anyway,
you guys? Yeah.
but does anyone have any questions before I say any
Yeah.
something? No. I was just going to say you picked a good week to pick on the Ibn Ezra, Ada Yom Hazeh in the Torah reading, but we'll have to leave that for another shir.
Yes.
Famous Ibn Ezra and Parshat Lech
Yes.
Lecha. That
Yes.
Baknani Baprizi
Asba.
right? But Baknani as Baaretz. The
Right.
Knani is still in the land. Whatever, we'll leave that for another time. But yes, okay. Tomorrow at 1 p.m. Eastern, Rabbi Dr. Ari Zivitovsky, professor of neuroscience at Bar-Ilan University.
And Mishpacha. He's Mishpacha to me
Oh, I didn't know that. How's it your mishpacha?
because my wife Rachel,
Right.
her sister married Ilan Zivitovsky.
Okay,
So,
very nice.
so by
So,
marriage, we're related.
anyways,
That's a cousin. Yeah.
so from Beit Shemesh, she's giving a shir tomorrow on Mechemet Mitzvah. That's a one-time shir, 1 p.m. tomorrow. And then tomorrow evening, Rabbi Yitzchak Et Shalom will be giving our Parsha shir on Parsha Lech Lecha. And Friday morning, please God, I'll be giving my regular Siddur shir at 9:15. And then Sunday morning, Rabbi Leaptag. And, continuing through the week. I think we have a new story starting next week. Just keep a lookout for all the emails. And please invite a friend to come. And thank you very much. Thank you, Rav Nadi. And okay, everybody will. And good. Okay. We Canadians, we're like I said yesterday, you know what they say in Canada, when the Americans when they sneeze in America, we get a call in Canada.
Yes.
Like the tariffs, that's it. Our economy
Tariffs are coming. The tariffs are
70% of Canadian exports go to the United States. The problem is I don't want to get into it, but forget the politics, but you should just know economically, billions of, most Americans don't realize how dependent they are on Canada for trade. Like it's going to hurt America more than it hurts Canada to put a 10% tariff on Canadian goods.
I agree with
I'll just economically, but that's for another, I'm a former accountant, so, got to talk economics a little bit.
Okay.
They're going to start with China, Jay.
Okay, no, I don't know. I don't want to go there.
Erev Tov to everybody.
Erev Tov.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Rabbi.
Erev Tov.
Very good. Thank you, everybody. Be well. Thank you. Lila Tov, everybody. Okay.